Hello, everybody. Welcome to Appreciating Poetry with me, Greg Kelly, PhD, your host. We're going to spend a few episodes exploring a poem by William Wordsworth, published in 1798, called, well, it has a very lengthy name, but the title that it's known by is Tintern Abbey. And we're starting with Wordsworth's expression of how humans, the human species, have messed up the world, and that when you perceive the objects of nature and when you remember them, that gives some comfort, that has a healing power, according to Wordsworth. And so I thought we would do two things today. The first is just remind ourselves what we talked about last time, and our emphasis was on this tension between the way that people have messed the world up. By people, I mean the human species, especially in modern times, and the tension between that and with the healing power of nature. And so I wanted to start with that and continue with a look at a different poem by William Wordsworth called Lines Written in Early Spring, which is a slightly later poem than Tintern Abbey, but a little bit simpler and a little bit shorter than Tintern Abbey. And when we look at Tintern Abbey, we're only going to look at bits and pieces here and there. I mean, it's not a long poem. It's not the Iliad or Paradise Lost, but it's about 200 some odd lines. So, we're not going to be able to look at every little word. So that's one thing I want to do. I want to look at some of the themes of humanity and nature in Tintern Abbey and look at them in perhaps a simpler form in Lines Written in Early Spring. But I also, and maybe this is kind of preliminary before we get started, I also want to go back to the very beginning of these meetings, these discussions, because what I hope to do is to just help people appreciate poetry. And so basically, I just want to share something that is of intrinsic value with people. And of course, you have access to you don't need me to go find poems to read and enjoy. But I guess what I hope to do is to help people discover what there is to appreciate in poetry. What is it that people who are enthusiastic about poetry, as I am, what do they find of value in poetry? And so we need to talk about value, which is kind of an ongoing thing, I guess. And we need to talk about what it is that makes poetry valuable. And then we can talk about how to derive the value, how to discern the value in poetry. So if you go to my website with the absurd URL, appreciating poetry for at word, no, appreciating poetry for number 4 .wordpress.com, appreciating poetry for .wordpress.com. If you go there and scroll down to the very bottom, that is to say, go way back in time, because new episodes get posted at the top every week or so. If you go back to the beginning there, you'll see a little piece I wrote called Value, in which I make the claim, which is not original to me, that value is object given. And we make a mistake when we confuse our evaluation of something with what I just referred to as the intrinsic value of something. So there's something about water, for example, that people should approve of because water is necessary for life. Similarly, there's something about the arts, including poetry, that people should appreciate because the arts are expressions of culture, expressions of individual creativity, and they're also things that can be made well or badly. And when you can find something that's made well, that's worthy of our appreciation. So that's my little spiel on value. Now, what it is that makes poetry valuable is what it is that makes the arts valuable. And I just talked about some of that. Obviously, this doesn't even qualify as scratching the surface. But in a work of art, a painting or a sculpture or a kid's drawing or any work of art, we can perceive, we can witness the expression of a culture. We can also witness the expression of a person. And I think that that's really important. In fact, I think that's the place to start, is to try to think about the expressive dimension of art, that art expresses not just how people feel, but the attitudes people hold toward life, the universe, and everything. Now, how to find what's worth appreciating in poetry? That's a difficult question. And I think it's useful for us to consider that the basic meaning of the word art really isn't about expression. The basic meaning of the word art is about skill or know-how. So we can certainly think about the art of sculpture or painting or something, and we imagine, especially in the modern world, but also definitely in the ancient world, when we think about painting or sculpture, for example, we assume that there are people who know how to do it. Now, in modern times, that's been complicated somewhat. Since we've grown to appreciate outsider art, we've grown to appreciate art from different cultures. And we can appreciate art from different cultures, even if we don't know the language, or shall we say, the signifying functions that give the art its expressive dimension. But nevertheless, we can appreciate music, for example, from other cultures, even though we don't know the musical system that the practitioners in that culture might be exercising. Nevertheless, a very basic idea of art is that it's the practice of somebody who knows how to do it. So now, as a modern, I'm very happy to open that wide. However, got to recognize that everybody is free to create art. Everybody is free to enjoy art. But there are some people who have put a lot of time into getting good at it, at developing this skill. So in a way, at base, the word art and the word skill are almost the same thing. They mean almost the same thing. One comes from Latin art, and one comes from Germanic languages, skill. Now, the Greek word for, I don't know Greek, but I do know that the Greek word for art or skill in this sense is technique, techne. So when we say that somebody knows how to do something, we're saying they know the techniques. It's know how, not know what exactly, although know how obviously requires lots of know what. Now, this is a very iffy thing because we can appreciate, for example, a musical performance without knowing very much about the technical process that goes into that performance. In other words, we hear somebody play the violin, and I can tell you, I definitely do not know how to play the violin, and so we can just listen to the music and appreciate the musical performance without knowing a whole lot about the technical element. On the other hand, if we do understand something about the technical element, that's going to help us understand. So if we just talk about performance, which is not essential for poetry, but it's a way of understanding the technical dimension, because when we think of artistic technique, something like musical technique is a good way to understand what it's about. Obviously, there's also compositional technique and so forth, but if we just focus on performing technique, we can appreciate that the performer has, for example, played the note in key. This is not easy on the violin. If you've ever heard a beginning violinist, that's what we call intonation. So the violin doesn't make sounds with separate keys the way the piano does. It doesn't have frets the way a guitar does. So it's more like the trombone, where the performer has to just know where the note is and hit it. And that's quite a technical challenge when you're starting out on that instrument. So just appreciating that an artist, that a performing artist, has achieved a good intonation, that's an example of how a little understanding of the technical element is very helpful. Now, with poetry, I think that condition of appreciating the technical element is heightened, because the material of poetry is not, for example, performance on an instrument. The material of poetry is the medium of everyday life, the medium of human existence, namely language. So from earliest times, I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of years ago, and even earlier than that. Um, People have made things out of language. The word poet from Greek means something like maker. So we're all born with the ability to speak and listen. I mean, language is in the DNA of humans. I think we're also born with the capacity to sing. And my evidence for that is the fact that most primate species, even the ones who are pretty far away from having discursive language, most primate species are highly vocal. I mean, some are amazingly vocal, like the aptly named howler monkey. So in order to sing, you got to have a song. Now, my 3-year-old granddaughter makes up songs all the time, and she's really great. Now, she doesn't think of that as a technical process, but notice she's unconcerned with whether the lines rhyme. Now, if you listen to pop music or operatic music or any singing, you're going to hear that in the vast majority of cases, there's rhyme in there. And it's almost a necessity in music that there's going to be something like meter. That is to say, music inherently has rhythm built into it. So if you're going to put words to music or music to words, the rhythms of the language and of the music have to be compatible. So when we think about the technical matters that go into the making of poetry, that's a really good place to start, is with sound. For example, rhyme. Now, once we establish that we don't appreciate a poem necessarily in a particular sequence, but a basic level of poetic composition is the sounds of the language, and this manifests itself most importantly in rhythm, and only slightly less importantly in rhyme. Now, Tintern Abbey is unrhymed, but the rhythm is quite definite, a pattern of alternating stressed and unstressed syllables. That's just kind of an English language thing, that English language has very strongly stressed syllables. So we say syllable, not syllable or syllable. And early on in these discussions, I talked about climbing the ladder, that a way to understand what there is to appreciate in poetry is to begin with sound. And so notice that the makers of ballads, and indeed songwriters throughout history, including the present, have not been particularly experts in poetic form. However, we saw how there are hundreds and thousands of these ballads in English and in other related languages that have this alternating pattern of 8 syllables alternating with 6 syllables. And this pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that create the characteristic meter of the ballad stanza. So devices of sound are not meaningful in the sense that they convey a message or something. However, patterns are pleasing. Patterns of sound are pleasing, and music is all about patterns of sound. So even when the music falls away and you just have the written word, the pattern of sound, it tends to be pretty basic. Secondly, that sound with a pattern is more memorable than just the speech that comes rolling off our tongue. And then we can go upward from there. So obviously the individual word choices are important because individual words do carry a message, not just the dictionary meaning of the word, but also many words have emotional baggage that poets love to put into them. A step up from that is sentence structure. Now, I would say sentence structure is probably more significant in prose writing, that is non-poetic writing, but sentence structure is certainly very important, and lots of poets use sentence structure in very creative and sophisticated ways. For example, the poet William Butler Yeats is really good at suspended sentences. So he'll have, say, a subject early on in a big old sentence, and then he'll have some interruptions, and then finally, 2 or 3 or 4 lines later, the verb will show up. A step up from that is the image. So lots of times, especially when the language is rather concrete instead of abstract, lots of times you read or hear a little snippet of poetry and you can't help it. You're just going to see the images that that language creates. Many times images are figurative in their function. So to the Romans, image and figurative language meant the same thing. Now, I would say virtually every metaphor contains an image. Not every image is necessarily metaphorical, but it's definitely an easy transition from a train of images to a train of metaphors. And sometimes the image takes on a symbolic meaning. In other words, there's a general significance beyond sort of the immediate function of the word, so that the reference to some object or the image of some object takes on a general significance, an abstract significance. So, for example, the wind or the breeze in Wordsworth often has a symbolic significance. So sound, word, sound, especially rhythm, word, sentence, image, figure, these are the kinds of things you look for. And these are the kinds of things that you can appreciate in a poem. It doesn't take a great deal of expertise. And I would also freely admit that you don't have to be particularly analytical about it. However, I do have to say that just as your appreciation of a performance on the violin takes into account the technical dimension, especially the technical challenge, so too the appreciation of poetry is enhanced by a modest understanding of some of the technical elements of the poems you read. Now, we looked at Tintern Abbey, and we noticed that it was unrhymed lines of poetry. So I'm looking at some of it here. In darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart. So I gotta tell you, technically, this is quite amazing. You will notice this in the other supreme practitioners of this kind of writing. This unrhymed iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is very technical, but these 10-syllable lines with the alternating stressed, unstressed. So, I mean, if I overdo it, which is kind of gross, just to show you, in darkness and amid the many shapes, yada, 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 yada. Right, so a beginner makes the whole thing sound like yada, 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 yada. The amazing thing about Wordsworth, and let me add Shakespeare and Milton, is that you don't really notice that every single line is yada, 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 or yada, 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 yada. So, right, I mean, you can just read it and enjoy it as the rather prosy sounding poetry that it is. However, believe me when I tell you that that prosy sound is extremely difficult to achieve. Why a poet would want to achieve that? Well, having raised the question, I guess I got to answer it. I would take it back to Shakespeare, or indeed Shakespeare's immediate predecessor, Marlowe. I don't know why in the late 16th century, blank verse, this unrhymed iambic pentameter caught on in England, but it did. And I think it has to do with the stage. I think it has to do with theater. How do you get a guy, an ordinary guy, to sound like a king? You know, well, one way to do it is to have him say, so shaken as we are, so wan with care, find we a time for frighted peace to pant. He just won a battle, but he's exhausted. Okay. So Wordsworth's blank verse is really good. And if you don't know anything about blank verse, you can still appreciate Wordsworth. Just look at what he's saying. What he's saying here is that the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart. So this is this unusual Wordsworthian use of the word world. The world is too much with us, the world of competition, the world of getting and spending, the world of fever and fretful stir unprofitable. Okay, so what humanity has made is a world of competition and indeed antagonism. And the relation of the human species to the natural world is no better than the relation of humans to other humans. It too has turned into a relationship of competition and antagonism. However, nature can feed us with lofty thoughts, and the evil tongues and rash judgments and sneers of selfish men will not prevail. So nature has this healing power. So I want to look at lines written in early spring. And there's something peculiar in this poem that I want to show you. And I think I'm going to start with the meter. So we have iambic tetrameter. That is to say, instead of 5 groups of 2 syllables, like this one, we've got 4 groups of 2 syllables. And again, it's this alternating unstressed followed by stress. So I heard 1,000 blended notes. But and there's 3 lines like that. So it's kind of like Wordsworth has taken a ballad stanza and kind of just modified it, just souped it up. So we've got the rhyme of notes with thoughts. It's close. We have reclined in mind. This is just like a ballad stanza, but a ballad stanza has tetrameter, trimeter. That is to say, a line of 4 groups of 2 syllables, or an 8-syllable line, alternating with a line of 3 groups of 2, or a 6-syllable line. So what Wordsworth gives us is, instead of tetrameter, trimeter, tetrameter, trimeter, which is what we saw in the ballads that we looked at early on, we have tetrameter, 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 trimeter. In other words, 4 I, 4 yadas, just in a sequence, and then 3 of them. And notice that Wordsworth, super good technician. So I heard 1,000 blended notes. So it's like this rich plenitude, 1,000. It just means so many, you can't count them. Blended notes. So basically it's the bird singing and the breeze in the trees. I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined. The language is a little old-fashioned here, even for Wordsworth. The stand of trees. In that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts, right? So 3 8-syllable lines that all sound nice, very pleasant, very sweet. In that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. So that 4th line, see, it's shorter and it doesn't fit right. See, if it had gone, I heard 1,000 blended notes and something saw, alternating tetrameter, trimeter, that would have been totally normal. But we get tetrameter, 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 trimeter. 4, 4, 4, 3. Or if you're counting syllables, 8, 8, 8, 6. All right. To her fair works did nature link the human soul that through me ran. That's an interesting kind of little tip here. The human soul that through me ran. Now, earlier, last time, we saw felt in the blood and felt along the heart. How can you feel something along the heart? Well, here it's a little more explicit. The human soul that through me ran. So is he talking about one soul that's running through my one body? Maybe. However, I have reason to believe that we're going to discover that he's talking about the human soul generally, as if there's only one that runs through everybody. So the human soul ran through me, and it probably ran through everybody else. we're not there yet, but I think that that's how to make this line make sense. And much it grieved my heart to think what man has made of man. So notice, we're linked to the fair works of nature. The fair works of nature link with the soul. And as soon as Wordsworth says the word think, we see that what man has made of man is an occasion for grief. Grief, that's a bad feeling. You don't feel happy, but it's a specific bad feeling because it has to do with loss. Much it grieved my heart to think what man is made of man. So man used to be something good, and then man made man lose some of that goodness. And we've seen this before, right? The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Through primrose tufts in that green bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreath, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. Now, I can tell you that Wordsworth in the first decade of the 19th century was very broadly ridiculed for saying that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. Okay, people, maybe you think this now. Flowers are just dumb plants. They don't have brains. How do they enjoy anything? Well, enjoys the air it breathes. Remember I told you that the breeze, the wind has a symbolic meaning in Wordsworth. I think it's symbolic of the soul that through me ran. And notice that nature linked the human soul to her fair works. So it makes sense that the fair works of nature are linked with qualities that we associate with the human soul, such as enjoyment, joy. All right. Now Wordsworth gets really ridiculous if you're a materialist. The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure. Bird brains. You can't measure their thoughts? Well, guess what? You can't measure anybody's thoughts. I mean, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? That we take seriously only that which we can measure. But what are we measuring? Right? And sometimes we measure in feet and inches and pounds and ounces. And sometimes we measure in money and power and things like that. But you can't measure thought. And why should we imagine that only humans think? I mean, after all, we have the expression barking up the wrong tree, which means that the dog thinks the squirrel ran up one tree, but in fact, the squirrel ran up a different tree. So we're not that averse to saying that the animals that are near and dear to us, like the family dog, have thoughts. We're also willing to allow that those thoughts are different from the thoughts of humans. But for one thing, the world that a dog perceives is different from the world that humans perceive. So the least motion which they made seemed a thrill of pleasure, seemed to me like they were having a good time, and they probably were. Okay. The budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air. And I must do all I can that there was pleasure there. So little budding twigs catch the breezy air. So you see that the twigs are experiencing pleasure, and spreading out their fan, they catch the breezy air. The birds playful, and they experience pleasure, and the flower enjoys the air it breathes. So Wordsworth seems to think that there's a lot more consciousness in the world. I don't want to say world. There's a lot more consciousness in the universe than we're in a habit of admitting. Because I see twigs and little birdies and flowers all experiencing pleasure. If this belief from heaven be sent, if such be nature's holy plan. So notice Wordsworth equates heaven and nature. That reminds me a lot of Spinoza's nature or God or nature. If this belief from heaven be sent, if such be nature's holy plan. I love this, that Wordsworth is willing to say, if this is true, and in order to be able to say if this is true, you've got to entertain the possibility that it's not true. If this is true, that the soul of things links things together, at least living things. Well, twigs, I mean, they're barely living, but yeah. Flowers, birds, twigs. So Wordsworth thinks that this is holy because it's not just our thinking about things. When we think about things, we can't help ourselves. We think about bad things. And Wordsworth's solution is not don't think about bad things. Wordsworth's solution is understand the truth, that what man has made of man is a bad thing. And it's all the worse for being so unnecessary, that man need not have alienated himself from nature. And it follows, as day follows night, that having alienated oneself from the soul of nature, we have alienated ourselves from each other. We are selfish men. So what we're going to look at next time is Wordsworth's expression in Tintern Abbey of the life of things. The life of things. One life, many things. So that's for next time. We're going to go back to Tintern Abbey, and we're going to see into the life of things. All right. Thank you. That's it for me today. Bye-bye.